Hello, everyone, and welcome to ShelterHacks. My name is Tommy. I'm now a master's student at Stanford, so unfortunately, I can't be with you all today. But I'm here to share with you some of the insight I gained from building an app for the shelter last year. So, last year, when I was at Tufts, I led a team in building an app for the shelter street team. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the street team, they're a team that goes out onto the streets every night that the shelter is open and interacts with the guests, the people on the street, who I will now refer to as guests, who couldn't make it into the shelter. They give them any resources they need, both physical and so things like food and water and information that they might need, like numbers to call or other shelters in the area. And also just talk with them and help them feel like they're human. There are people out there who care about them, and build a relationship with them, because unfortunately some of these guests are out here for multiple months. So before we started this app, the way the street team operated was every team would have a note taker. They would type out everything that happened during the shift on their phone or write it down on Notepad. And at the end of the night, they would submit all the information through this form on the right here. So as you can see in this form, there's the people, the street team members who are involved. There's whatever resources were given out, and there's a place for giving some notes about what happened. And we identified that the most important of this is A, keeping track of resources, of the physical resources for inventory purposes, and B, keeping track of information with guests so they can better build relationships. But we also identified multiple issues with this. The first is that it's inefficient. You you're sort of typing out information first on your phone, and then you're resubmitting this information through this form, and that's inefficient. Second of all, there's no communication across multiple days. So a lot of street team members rotate throughout. So different people are going on shifts every night, and it's easy for information to get lost because people aren't actually going through and reading the notes of every street team member or all the shifts that happened beforehand. And third is that there's really no way to consolidate information about different guests on the streets, since they're all in these big text blocks in these note sections. So to after we identified this problem, we came up with what we wanted to build. So first, we wanted to build a profile system for the guests. So think of like a Facebook profile, and they have a name. It doesn't have to be their real name. It's whatever identifier they're comfortable with, and this will allow things that involve them to be logged under them. So information about them, what the shelter has given to them, and things like that. The second feature we thought of was a shared to-do list that persists across all users across multiple days, so that for future users can see, oh, me, Tommy, going on shift today, I said, hey, Misha, I'll bring you uh, a blanket tomorrow because I know yours has a hole in it. And then tomorrow, whoever's going on shift can see that and accomplish that task without my future involvement. So yeah, once we thought of what we wanted to do, we got to the planning phase, and that has two parts. The first part, here we go. The first part is the planning of the front end, and that is what modules we need exactly. So I highly recommend writing things down on a whiteboard. This is just something I drew up. It's very simple, but it shows exactly what modules we need. You log in, and then you have a guest module where you can see all the guest profiles. You can click on them, and that allows you to see information about the guests. Um, and You also have a to-do module, which is the to-do list I mentioned. This allows you to add things, complete items. And then finally, there's the information sort of brochure, which gives you things like the numbers that the guests might need or information about other shelters. Um, so the second part of this planning phase is planning out your schema, your database. So both of these things were they changed throughout time, and you will see that the final app, the final schema looked nothing like what we started out with. But it's still important to have an idea of what you want beforehand. So for us, so we have guests. So an individual guest has information about them, and he has this unique ID. And when we go into action items, which are the to-do lists, you can see each action item has sort of just information about it, what needs to be done, date, locations, and also the guests that this action item involves. So it allows us to refer back to the guests. And when you're doing these two planning phases, it's important to break things down. So once you have an idea, figure out exactly what you need to store, what modules you need to build. And also, it's important to keep track of the relationships between them. So on the front end, what leads to what, like what happens when you click on something, and on the back end, how the different things tie together, because you don't want to store things twice, right? And this is also where you identify your tech stack. So we used React Native and React Native and Firebase, and those things worked really well for us. And I highly recommend them for a hackathon like this because they're easy to use and very powerful. After the planning phase, you can finally get down to the building. So while you're building things, it's really important to take an iterative approach rather than a waterfall approach, which many of you are probably used to. The waterfall approach is you got a spec that's set in stone, you build whatever, and then you submit whatever. But for something like this, when you don't necessarily have a spec and you're working with real people who are going to be using whatever you build, it's important to talk with them throughout your development and ask them for what is actually, is this what you want? Is this actually going to be helpful? And feel free to throw away a module completely or add something new. So I'll give you a real example of what we did. We went on, everyone on my team went on shifts at the shelter back in last November. Sorry about that. And actually tested out what it'd be like to use this app and sort of observe the current process. And we learned many things. First, we learned that there really is a need for this app because it's November, it's freezing in the Boston winter, right? And it's hard to be just typing all the time, and you get tired, and it's not pleasant. And second of all, we learned something really important that we didn't think of beforehand, which is when you're actually interacting with people, you're not interacting with individual guests. Often you're interacting with them in groups. So up to this point, everything you see here is based around the idea of individual guests with one profile and things attached to that. But once we realized that you're interacting with people in groups, we came up with this interaction system. And I would say this is now the most important feature of our app, which we didn't even have beforehand. So an interaction involves, it has a title, what happened. It involves multiple guests. So you can tag multiple guests. You can tag a location. You can have a date. You have a description of what you guys talked about. And then you have items that were given out to all these guests. So not only is this more natural for, I guess, the street team members using it because they don't have to go through every guest and add information about them separately. This also helps us keep track of the relationship between the guests, right? Who is hanging out with who, so we can better help them and better, I guess, build long-term relationships with them with this information. So to recap, you want to be iterating through and you want to be talking with the either trying things out yourself or talking with the users, the people in the shelter who are actually using it to make sure that what you're building is actually helpful. So yeah, that's basically what we did, and I have a final few pieces of advice for you. So hopefully you can also succeed. First is dream big, but think small. So what I mean by dream big is don't just think of what you can do to help the shelter be more efficient or help improve something they're already doing. Also think of uh, giving them opportunities, giving them options that they never had. So for us, we thought of this guest profile system, which didn't exist beforehand, and hopefully this will help the shelter in the long run accomplish their goals of building relationships. But think small in the sense that really break things down into individual modules and work on them, uh, not necessarily one at a time, but make sure that whatever you build, you can finish. I always think for hackathons or projects like these, it's better to finish with one proof of concept module and say that here, this is really polished. This is clearly something you can use, rather than saying these are three half completed modules and here you go. And my final piece of advice is this is a hackathon. It's not just for the shelter, it's also a chance for you to learn something, to experiment with some new technology you weren't familiar with before, and finally just have fun with it all, right? What's the point if you're not having fun? So yeah, enjoy the free food, uh, make some friends, meet some new people, and don't burn out in the first few hours, and make this something enjoyable. So yeah, that was my 2 cents on how we developed this app. Hopefully that was helpful for you as well, and good luck with your own projects. Thank you for listening.